Welcome to the English Baha'i Summer School here at Wellington College in Crowthorne in the south of England. We're delighted to have with us at this summer school for his first visit to an English summer school, Mr. Glenford Mitchell, who retired in 2008 after 26 years of service on the Universal House of Justice. Mr. Mitchell is giving a series of talks here at the summer school on world order of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i concept of world civilization and the future of society. So we've taken the opportunity here with a group of young Baha'is to have a discussion about some of the themes that are going to be covered in these talks and to explore what the implications of this idea of world order are for the youth of today. So, Mr. Mitchell, welcome to Wellington College.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Our first question, I suppose, would be to look from a Baha'i perspective. When we turn on the news, when we see the media, the newspapers, we see so much turmoil in the world, yes. And the Baha'is have a very positive image and a positive vision of the future. So how do we explain, how do we understand what this turmoil is all about?
I think that the Baha'is do understand that a new spirit has been infused into the world. That this spirit comes from the fact that there has been a divine visitation, so to speak. In other words, a messenger of God has arrived on the planet, and the very fact of it has created a great stir in the world. We see turmoil in some respects, and we see great progress, great development. What is interesting, though, is that this appearance of Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet of God and is the founder of the Baha'i faith, what is interesting about this is that his appearance has coincided with a stage, a very advanced stage in the evolution of human society. We have come from the stage of family and tribe and then city-state and then nation-state. And at this very point of nation-state, when you might say that humanity is in its adolescent stage, Baha'u'llah has come to say that this is the time for humanity to mature and enter its adult stage. And so meaning to say that there ought to be a world order, a system that makes all of the peoples of the world citizens of one world, citizens of one country. And so this is what is causing the stir in the world. We of course have always been in contention, in conflict, never mind what stage we are at, but humanity has always tried at certain stages to avoid the consequences of this conflict by creating leagues and federations and so on. And we see that the effects of the spirit that has been infused into us is both to disturb the old order, breaking down old barriers, and at the same time that this is happening, it causes a great deal of confusion. There's an awakening of human consciousness on a very wide scale, where we are all now suddenly aware of each other on the planet, and this is of course encouraged and by the advances in technology, in communications technology in particular. Imagine that we sitting here could, by the touch of a button, be communicating with somebody in Japan or in Zambia or someplace else. At the very time that is happening, we have so many conflicts. And I think that this, we Baha'is see as two simultaneous processes that are operating in a paradoxical pattern. One, we have what we call the processes of integration and disintegration. We see these two patterns, chaos and order at the same time. We see that, for instance, at the very time that we are having wars all over the world, international conflicts, that out of the huge conflicts of the 20th century, first we had a movement towards world order by the creation of a League of Nations, as you know, after the First World War. And then after that, we went back to war again, forgetting our earlier lessons of disaster and horror. And then we had the Second World War. And from that came the United Nations. So clearly there is a movement on the part of humanity, or at least of the governments, to bring about some sense of political order in the world. At the same time, the Baha'is see that there is a need for a spiritual transformation, so to speak, which means that it is not enough to have a political order or a political arrangement, because we can always slip back to old ways. But we need a spiritual change. In other words, Baha'u'llah tells us that the theme of this revelation that he's brought is the oneness of humankind, meaning that we should not only live together in love and in brotherhood and so on, but that we should look forward to a time when nations and states relate to each other as a human family. This is a rather remarkable kind of thing. But this is where we are headed, and that's where humanity is headed. And we have, as Baha'is, the job of teaching the spiritual principles of the faith to effect this spiritual transformation. Now, there are social consequences to that. For instance, this principle of the oneness of humankind also suggests that there has to be an elimination of all forms of prejudice. There has to be equality of men and women established in the world. It really means that we have to have a universal education, and at some stage compulsory, so that all of humanity at least will have a proper knowledge or amount of knowledge to cope with the world as it is now. And so that there should be no ignorance, total ignorance in the world. Now, what people do with their lives individually in terms of adopting crafts or professions is another matter. Diversity is also important here. And then the question of the independent investigation of truth. That is, we should not be content to abide by the preachments of the clergy or the politicians or anybody else, but we should investigate especially spiritual truth for ourselves. And in that sense, the Baha'i faith is not dogmatic. In other words, it does not insist that one becomes a Baha'i, but it does open the door to all those who wish to investigate what it has come to say in the world. Yeah.
It sounds very idealistic, and one would look at the situation in the world today and say that the forces of chaos, as you describe them, are probably outweighing the forces of integration. Mm-hmm. So where does the will come from to want to change the world? Because it's one thing to have great ideas, but if there's a large proportion of governments or even humanity who don't want that change or are clinging on to outworn ways of operating, how does the will change on a mass scale?
Well, I think that we are seeing a change in the attitudes of people about the world. For instance, there's much greater interest in people who are suffering. There's a great interest in bringing about equality of the sexes, and there's a lot of talk about it and a lot of really practical effort being made. We see that a great deal of emphasis is being put on education as a means of relieving people of suffering and bringing about a better life, economic and otherwise. But it is not enough to rely on academic training and training in skills and so on and crafts. One has to have an inner feeling about one's relations to others. And here is where Baha'u'llah has told us that this principle of the unity of the human race is the theme, the pivotal principle that should drive our activities now. We see that in so many activities that don't go by any kind of religious identification, that people are striving in this way. So what Baha'u'llah has brought and what he has said marks the timeliness of the efforts that are being made now. Now, Baha'u'llah didn't just bring philosophical ideas, idealistic thoughts. He also brought a system. In other words, he recommended a method for achieving what he calls a new world order. It is quite interesting to see in the time of his ministry that the first thing that he did was to proclaim his appearance and his mission to the rulers of the world at that time. The ruling heads in Europe, the Shah of Iran in his own homeland, and of course he got a very negative reception from all of them. The Shah killed the messenger who took his message to him, and I think perhaps the only sort of reasonable non-committal response was from Queen Victoria, who apparently said that if this is of God, then it can do no harm. Never mind. The fact is that he made this proclamation, and he invited them to begin the process of organizing the planet politically. He asked them to come together as heads of state and to discuss, to consult on those questions that would resolve the conflicts of the human race, that there was a need for a federated world, for a world government. There was a need to reduce the number of the size of armaments held by individual nations. He said that there should be a world government that would have the responsibility for protecting the world in many ways, that individual states would have enough armaments for their internal policing, but that they didn't need to have huge armaments. All right. He said that they should be able to consult to resolve their problems. That problems should not be resolved on the battlefield. And that in that arrangement, if one state rose up against another, then all would resist that kind of aggression. Now, it's interesting that in the past, writers, philosophers, political writers in Europe were advocating similar things, going back even to the period of the Middle Ages. But now Baha'u'llah says the time has come for that. All right, how is this to come about? It is not something to be forced upon humanity by the faith that Baha'u'llah has brought. It is something that will come about because of the reaction of sensible people, rulers, to the consequences of not abiding by peaceful means. And so we saw, for instance, that in the case of the First World War and the Second World War, there was such a response. Yeah? All right. Now, Baha'u'llah has called upon his followers to do a job which politicians cannot do, which is to effect a change in the human spirit, in the attitude of human beings, which means that they have to develop a love for all of humanity. They have to shed their prejudices of one kind or another. They have to come to terms with the equality of the sexes. And this, to be grounded properly, would have to be connected with the belief in God and in a faith and in the prophet that has brought the message that prophets bring. So this is where we are. So we have two processes, so to speak. We have one that is intended to help to spiritualize humanity, which the Baha'is are attempting to do. And on that very side, they also are establishing or trying to establish what they call an administrative order, which will assist them to conduct a world campaign in bringing about this spiritual change. And this administrative order has principles of election and consultation and in manners that are not practiced in the world necessarily. And this process, along with the process that will be followed by the rulers, by the governments and so on, in bringing about a world system, will at some stage merge. And out of this merging, this culmination, will come what Baha'u'llah calls a new world order, which we have not yet experienced in any of our history.
Okay, so let's take a question from the youth here. Naveed.
Mr. Mitchell, I just wanted to ask, if one is to examine the state of the world today, there's no doubt that there's a lot of suffering. Now, aside from natural disasters and things like that, A lot of people have died, and a lot of people continue to die in the name of religion, even within the same religion, you know, with sects within. And I'm just curious to know that, albeit a world religion as well, from the same God, what's different about the Baha'i faith, and why will it not go astray?
It is true that religion has been blamed for much of the turmoil in the world, and I think justly so. And the reason is not that the prophet of any religion gave a message that would stir confusion and conflict and disorder, but it's that those who took up his message and decided to administer the affairs of his religion made up their own rules as they went along, and to the extent that they understood the principles of the faith, things went well. To the extent that they invented their own ideas in response to the message, that they set up systems and rituals and so on, problems started to develop. And then as prejudices express themselves in different groupings of people, depending on their own peculiar needs and wants and so on, we saw this. Then conflict was always there. Now look at the very fact that each religion that we have known until now has split up into different sects, following the ideas or the attitudes of the different leaders, different people who have made themselves into leaders. So to a large extent, the conflict in the world is due to what you might call the man-made aspects of the religion, those adopted by the clergy for the most part. And so that's part of what we know, and it's demonstrable. It's happening now. You can see it. In the case of the Baha'i faith, we have a way of warding off such extremes. For instance, Baha'u'llah made two provisions in his revelation. First, he appointed an interpreter of his writings, so that interpretation would not be left to anybody willy-nilly. That is not to say that individuals cannot draw their own conclusions from what they read, but they cannot inflict their interpretations on others or on society, because there's an authorized center of authority. The other thing that Baha'u'llah did to prevent this was to create an administrative order with established principles. So, for instance, he's called for a local house of justice in each locality, in each village, each hamlet, made up of elected members. He's called for a similar institution at the national level, what you call the secondary level of society, and an institution at the international level, known as the Universal House of Justice, which has the ultimate authority in conducting the affairs of the faith in the world. Now, each of these institutions has its own sphere of functioning, its own jurisdiction. Now, the Universal House of Justice has a particular responsibility, which is, one, to uphold and promote the laws left by Baha'u'llah, and two, to make laws of its own that are not in conflict with what Baha'u'llah has laid down, that will relate to and respond to the needs of humanity from one stage of its development to another. So, for instance, if a certain condition exists today, for which the House of Justice made a decision, if that condition changes, then the House of Justice can change its own decision later on, or a future House of Justice can do that. That means then that it is possible for the Baha'i world community to stay actually in the forefront of all progressive movements, because it's of the flexibility that has been infused into its operation by Baha'u'llah's own arrangement. So these arrangements then prevent the need for sects or the excuse for setting up sects, because you have authorized interpretations and you have authorized institutions that have been given the means of making decisions that will respond to the requirements of the times.
So we have another question. Yes, Ashkan.
Mr. Mitchell, going back to the idea of the Baha'i faith having very great ideals, one has to appreciate that there are only 6 million Baha'is, the needs of which the House of Justice has to cater for at the moment. And should the Baha'is achieve their desired future and many more people become Baha'is, how will the House of Justice deal with problems such as the financial crisis which we are currently in? Will the House of Justice have the authority to create new institutions?
Yes. Well, I think that how the House of Justice will function in a distant future, where you have what we hope will be a majority of Baha'is, is not exactly clear to us, because we are not in that situation now. However, you have to think that there will be a world government, or the rulers of the world as they are now will eventually establish a world government. That government will govern such things as finances and so on. That's their business. Now, it may well be that in a world where you have a majority of people, Baha'is say, let us project in that way, that the government may want to seek the advice of the Universal House of Justice from the point of view of the teachings of Baha'u'llah, what he may have had to say about the spiritual underpinnings of the economy, of economic development. But whether the House of Justice itself would be ruling on financial questions is doubtful. I don't know. It would depend on its relations to the established governmental authorities at that time. And as you know, we are not in the business of conflicting with governments and disobeying governments and running roughshod over governments. We are in the business of uniting our efforts with the established authorities on the planet.
But if there are a majority of Baha'is in the future, will a world government still exist or not?
Yes, because Baha'u'llah says there will be a world government, and that's part of the divine process. The fact that there is a Baha'i community doesn't mean necessarily that the Baha'i institutions will be running the community as governments. Not necessarily. But the House of Justice would have to decide on this.
But did Baha'u'llah actually lay down the laws for how a world government should function and how it should be elected?
Leaders of the world will have to devise the means of creating a world government. What he has laid out as a general principle is that they should consult together, that they should make decisions, and they should enforce them. All right? So what the relationship will be to the House of Justice, which is the supreme institution of the Baha'i faith, which is to uphold the laws of Baha'u'llah, is something yet to be determined, is something to see. And we do not have the experience, nor do we live in a time when we can appreciate the dynamics that will be at work to enable that kind of relationship between the two. Yes.
Another question, Layli.
So there's always worries and fears concerning power, and I was just wondering, with this world government, is there a danger of over-centralization of power?
You mean that there might be an over-centralization of power in the House of Justice, you mean? Or in the world government? Whatever? No, because what Baha'u'llah has proposed for his own system of internal administration is a decentralized system. You have a local spiritual assembly or a local House of Justice with its sphere of authority. You have the national and you have the universal. And they all have particular functions. And they all have jurisdictions that they have responsibilities. So they're, in a way, somewhat autonomous in certain respects. We believe in a decentralized system. We do not believe in over-centralization at all of power. But there it's necessary for there to be scales you see, in the authority of governments and of systems. And you see, one of the things, for instance, that makes this order workable is that the local people make a decision, let us say, the local institution. But the local Baha'is or the local people are unhappy about it, whether it's government or the Baha'i community are unhappy about it. They have the right to appeal to that local authority to reconsider, right? If the local authority does not reconsider and insists on its own prior ruling, then the people have the right to appeal to a higher authority for consideration. Going through that institution with its appeal, that institution will have to explain itself to the higher authority, perhaps a National House of Justice, National Spiritual Assembly. The National Assembly may rule in favor of the decision made by the local authority or not. And that might end the matter. But then, if there's still concern, that appeal can go up to the Universal House of Justice, which makes the final decision. So you see in this a decentralized system, a system that makes room for people to express themselves freely and to raise issues and questions whenever they find it necessary to do so. And the whole system is protected by this arrangement.
Any other questions? Yes, Luca.
Many religions in the past have promised peace and unity and have collapsed into sects. As a faith, how do we actually provide what we have promised?
While it is true that the religions that have come, the major religions, have taught about peace and love and so on, I'm not aware of any that made a very specific promise that peace would be the result of its appearance. What I do know is that in the scriptures of old, and leading up until now, that there was always a pointing to the future when there would be peace and world order. Going back to Isaiah, for instance, where he said there would be a government on the soldiers, on the shoulders of a child who would rule with justice and peace forever. But no prophet, Jesus didn't promise peace forever. You remember in one stage he said, I come not to bring peace but a sword, so to speak, because he understood the behavior of human beings. And it was not possible for any prophet to, as we see now looking back, to promise world peace when the world had not yet discovered itself. They appeared at times when a large part of humanity was not yet discovered, or parts of the world had not yet been discovered. So the practical idea of world peace was not possible. What they hoped for is that there would be peace among their members, among their followers, that they would not fight with each other. But since they did not leave specific arrangements for the administration of their religions, and in many instances did not leave specific interpretations of the meaning of what they had to say, and so others took on the job of interpreting without in particular appointment by the Prophet, the teachings, we've had confusion, you see. I think that now that Baha'u'llah has come, he tells us that the age of prophecy is past, that he has opened the age of fulfillment, and he proclaims the advent of a new world order which will embody this world peace and world unity that we have been promised by the scriptures of the past. So it seemed that humanity had to have the experiences that we have gone through, some of them rather rough ones, to be able to appreciate the magnitude of what Baha'u'llah has proclaimed and the importance of it at this time.
But many people in the past have become disappointed with religion. Why don't we expect that to happen with the Baha'i faith?
Well, as I said earlier, people have been disappointed, or at least have had to deal with the various interpretations of the meaning of God's word made by people that were not authorized to interpret anything. And so when they insisted on their ways of interpreting things. One person insists this way, he has his followers. Another person insists another way, believing in the same prophet, he has his followers. They have separate congregations, they have different rituals, and so on. This has caused a problem. In the case of Baha'u'llah, he has not left his religion without authorized interpreter and without authorized institutions invested with the authority to function in accordance with his will, and he's left a book of laws.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, Kat.
This world order that you're speaking about, it sounds wonderful and it sounds truly ideal, but with the state of the world as it is today, I feel that a lot of people are really hopeless. And in addition, we know that people who are in positions of power may oppose you. How do you know that you're going to succeed?
This question of a new world order is, of course, not new. Humanity has been discussing the concept for a very long time, but it did not, those who wrote about it did not have necessarily specific ideas. Of course, in the writings of certain of our great thinkers, in Europe in particular, there have been outlines for the way that a European Union or a European Federation would function, in the writings of people like Crousset from France, and there was Henry IV of France who had a grand design for unifying the continent, and you had people like William Penn and so on who wrote about these things. So it's not a strange idea to have, and some of them thought beyond Europe that there should be a world order. What is important here is that Baha'u'llah has left it to the rulers of the world, the governments, to chart the course towards world order, towards a world government, which is inevitable. They cannot escape this reality. And they keep sidling up to it and gradually, incrementally moving towards it, but they hate the idea of world government because of what it implies, because of the very bad experience that we have had with rather horrible ideologies, particularly in Europe. Fascism and so on, those orders that wanted to establish a world order. Well, people are frightened about these things, these totalitarian approaches. What we're talking about is quite different. We're not talking about a totalitarian thing. We're talking about a situation in which people have the freedom to speak, to raise issues, to appeal against decisions, where governments make decisions on the basis of consultation, discussion, like in the Parliament here in England, and so on, and where the people will be elected to the institutions that they will run. So we're talking about something quite different from the ideological structures that have come about in the 20th century that has made us afraid of the idea of world government. But no one has an alternative idea. What else are we going to do about a world that has contracted into a neighborhood, a world that has drawn so close? We talk about globalization these days. We look to the financial situation in the world, the finances of the world, trade and finance, as a major means of bringing about globalization. Well, how are we to manage the economies of the world? How are we to take care of these issues unless we think globally? And from subject to subject, from case to case, this is the issue. How are we going to operate on a global level? It is not a question that can be fobbed off. It's not a question that can interminably be dismissed. It has to be dealt with. Look at the financial crisis we're having now. We're just barely coming out of it. Look at what happened in the first days of it. You saw for the first time the financial ministers of major governments coming together to consult about how to resolve a global problem. It never happened before. And we will see more and more of this. After the Second World War, we had the United Nations created, and we see what has happened there. And we see the benefits, in fact, of such efforts. The Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, that came out of the United Nations is a major major step in human development and in tackling a question that has plagued humanity for a long time. And so the writing is on the wall. There's no way to escape it. What we have to overcome is our fear of creating something that will become a source of evil in terms of what other systems, ideological systems, have become and that we have undone in recent times. I think that that is entirely possible now because we have learned from our lessons and because Baha'u'llah has come and he has set the pattern and given us laws that will assist us to live both spiritually and socially in a world that is united.
Yes, Tala.
So what is the process by which all these things you have described will come into being?
The achievement of world peace is not a goal that exclusively concerns the Baha'is. And the Baha'is will not be the only ones working towards that goal. It is a goal that will involve all of the people on the planet and all of the governments that exist on the planet. And so, as I said earlier, there's a sort of division of labor here. The rulers of mankind, the governments, will respond to the circumstances of life in the world, the political problems and so on, the difficulties that arise, and they will find a way to resolve it. And eventually they must move towards a global resolution of these problems. So that is a process is legitimate, and Baha'u'llah tells us that it will happen. All right, the Baha'is on their side will have to assist in bringing about a spiritual transformation where people will have respect for each other, will have love for each other, will also be able to overcome their prejudices and so on. And at the same time, Baha'u'llah has given them what he calls an administrative order, which calls on them to elect institutions to conduct their own affairs. He has abolished the clergy. And so in place of the clergy, he has elected corporate bodies that direct the affairs of the Baha'i community. Now, through the practice that these institutions will have, and the principles that they will apply in their consultations and in their electoral processes, which has no nomination, by the way, no campaigning, they'll also be setting a pattern, not only for themselves, but also for those who are trying to establish a world government. So they'll be able to contribute through their own example to the ultimate creation of a world order and peace on earth.
So, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mr. Glenford Mitchell, for your time today.
It's a pleasure.
And that concludes our program from the Baha'i Summer School here in England.